Welcome, everybody. I'm Nathaniel Deutsch, Professor of History and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies here at UC Santa Cruz. I want to begin by thanking all of the people on campus who made this happen. Special thanks to the Humanities Institute and to Irena Polic and Jessica Guild in particular, who helped us in the Center for Jewish Studies to plan and coordinate this event from the very beginning. And they are really, large part, why we're all here today. I also want to thank Kevin Dombey and Dave Morrison and their staffs for all the hard work that they put into this. And also thanks to Porter College for their generous co-sponsorship. And last but not least, Eden Lehman, the Jewish Studies intern, for all of the hard work that they put into this as well. So normally when I introduce an event, I prefer to keep my remarks short, and I'm still going to try to do that. I try to get out of the way as soon as possible, but in this case, I do think that I need to frame what we're about to do together in greater detail. I also sometimes wing it when I introduce events, but I'm not going to be doing that tonight. In that regard, I also want to apologize in advance for things that I should have said, things that I shouldn't have said, and things that I should have said better, because in my experience with events on this topic, when I kind of debrief afterwards, I invariably think to myself or say to other people, why did I say that? Why didn't I do that? What? So keep that in mind. Now, I've been a professor for 30 years, and for more than a decade, I was the faculty director of the Humanities Institute here at this university. In all of those years, I've never hosted an event for which I received more comments in advance than this one. I'd actually like to share just a few excerpts from those comments because I think they offer a sense of how important, urgent even, the topic of tonight's discussion is for many people, and also because they provide a sense of the wide range of opinions both about Zionism and about this event itself, and even the publicity for the event. I want to point out that these comments came from students, from parents of students, from professors at other institutions, alumni, and members of the broader community. One of the most striking things to me about my experience as a professor of Jewish studies in the last year is how many constituencies feel that they have a stake in Zionism and its impacts, not only in Israel and Palestine or in the Middle East more broadly, but also here in American universities. I'm going to share these comments without any commentary of my own, including regarding their accuracy. So one of these comments came from a rabbi that I know who was concerned that the event might, chas v'shalom, which is a traditional way of saying God forbid, encourage anti-Semitism. Another comment started this way: thank you for this much needed program. The blurb is misleading and inaccurate. It's not assaults versus massacre, it's an internationally defined 15-month genocide and domicide preceded by massacres versus the devastating retaliatory border massacre and mass kidnapping of October 7th that the Israeli government and military anticipated and suppressed any preparation for. Unquote. Another one. Thanks for the program notice. I find the description misleading since all three featured participants hold essentially the same critical views on Zionism. I'll get to the point that we only have two participants right now in a second. You couldn't or wouldn't come up with anyone having any other viewpoint? Or is your point that there is only one correct view? Kind of disappointing in my opinion. Another one. If students and staff cannot use the word genocide to describe what is happening in Gaza, hold events, discuss the loss of life freely in class, or critique the systems that empower it, I really don't find it appropriate that there is a UC-sponsored event expanding on what the future of Zionism looks like. It is out of touch, neo-colonialist, and racist. Just a couple more. What's with the lineup you selected for that panel on Zionism? They certainly are an echo chamber. They are all in the far left, if not the post-Zionist left. And then lastly, hell no. And I will leave that to you to interpret where that was coming from. Okay, so perhaps they and others who didn't write to us, but were thinking things about the event or about Zionism, maybe you'll feel the same way after tonight's event, or maybe you will think differently, but I hope that we all learn something together. So what is this event about? Many fields can and should contribute to our understanding of Zionism, including Middle Eastern studies, Palestine studies, settler colonial studies, and so on. We've had speakers on campus from these fields in the past year, as well as before that, who have explored different aspects of the topic. Moreover, we in the Center for Jewish Studies have reached out to people in these fields to collaborate on public events. Tonight, we bring you something different, but equally important. Our program focuses on what Jewish studies in particular can contribute to the study of Zionism. Jewish studies is a field whose scholars are experts in the history, culture, literature, ideas, and languages of the Jews around the world and during different periods. The scholars on the panel tonight have devoted years to studying the context and content of Zionism in a variety of languages, including by examining primary sources that are inaccessible without specialized training. As we will see, they have also published extensive original research on the topic, and I'll just share a little bit of that when I introduce them individually. They can situate Zionism within the longue durée and broader arc of Jewish history, culture, politics, and religion. Our goal is not to make anti-Zionists into Zionists or Zionists into anti-Zionists, but to create a public forum for thinking, discussing, and learning about this important topic together. So before I introduce our panelists, I want to describe the structure of the event. It's going to be two parts. First, Professor Alma Heckman, who is, as you'll see, a professor here of history and also of Jewish studies, and I will ask our panelists a series of questions relating to the past, present, and potential futures of Zionism. We got it down to 10 questions, and hopefully we'll get to all of them, but if we don't, as you'll see, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions too. We're going to open the questions up. We're going to open questions up to you, the audience. Now, when you came in, you should have received note cards that you can write questions on. Hopefully you have some kind of writing utensil to do that. Students will be circulating after our question and answer part to collect the cards, and then we will read the questions. We're going to do our best to read as many questions as possible. We think that by actually having the note cards, we hope at least that we'll actually get to more different kinds of questions, because sometimes when people just ask the questions from the floor, you have time, especially if people ask really long questions or make really long statements, that you're unable to get to a wide range of questions. We also hope that maybe with the anonymity that is provided by writing note cards, people who might feel uncomfortable for some reason to ask questions might do so. And we want to assure you that we're not going to censor questions because of their political orientation. If we don't read your questions exactly as you wrote it, it may be because we're combining it with another question that's on a similar topic. Okay, so who are we? First we have Professor Alma Heckman. As I mentioned, she's a professor of history in the Neufeld Levin Endowed Chair of Holocaust Studies here at UC Santa Cruz. Among other publications, she is the author of The Sultan's Communists, Moroccan Jews, and the Politics of Belonging. She is also the co-editor, along with me and Tony Michaels, of the forthcoming volume, Radical Jewish Politics, A Global Perspective. Next, we have Liora Halperin, who is Professor of International Studies and History and Distinguished Endowed Chair of Jewish Studies at the University of Washington. She's a historian of Israel-Palestine with particular interest in nationalism and collective memory, Jewish cultural and social history, language ideology and policy, and the politics of colonization and settlement. She's the author of The Oldest Guard, Forging the Zionist Settler Past, which is a study of the European Jewish agricultural colonies established in late 19th century Ottoman Palestine, and Babel and Zion, Jews, Nationalism, and Language Diversity in Palestine, 1920 to 1948. Next, we have Shaul Magid, who is a rabbi, as well as a professor of modern Jewish studies at Harvard University. He has written extensively on Zionism, anti-Zionism, diasporism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He is the author of many books and essays, most recently Meir Kahane, The Public Life and Political Thought of an American Jewish Radical, and The Necessity of Exile, Essays from a Distance. His present book project is The Political Theology of Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar, Zionism as Anti-Messianism. And we were going to have Dov Waxman, who is a professor at UCLA and the author of many books on Israel and Palestine, but because he is in Brentwood and had to be evacuated due to the fires, he couldn't be here today. So I'm very sorry that he wasn't able to come, and he sends his regards and his sadness that he can't be here. So with that, we're going to begin.
Okay, so I guess we'll start with a pretty foundational question, just to set the definitions. How would you define Zionism, and where does the term itself come from?
Okay, well, thank you so much, Alma. Thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you, all of you guys, for making the time in week 2 of your quarter to be here for this really important event. I think regardless of where you're coming from and why you're here, this is an important conversation to be having. And I often start my talks by saying, that some people who want to talk to you about Zionism will say, listen to me because everybody else is wrong. And I don't want to tell you that at all. In fact, I am where I am today because of the people that I've listened to, from my Palestinian colleagues, from my Palestine studies colleagues, from my Jewish studies colleagues. And so I hope you'll continue to go to events and lectures as they come. Keep building up your proficiency around these topics. It's incredibly, incredibly urgent. So I'll start, in answering your question to give my definition of Zionism, which is a little bit different than some of the definitions you might hear. So I define Zionism as the belief that modern Jewish problems can and must be solved or mitigated through a project of settler colonization in Palestine and the creation there of some type of polity, or political body by and for Jews. So what this definition allows us to see is that it encompasses Jews who defined the problems facing Jews in radically different ways, defined their desired solutions in different ways, had different ideas of which Jews should settle in Palestine, what sort of state or entity they should create, but the common thread between all of them is the idea that the way to get from A to B, from the problem to the solution, was settlement and the creation of a new Jewish polity. Once this groundwork of settlement began to be established, to be Zionist also meant, at least in some way, a belief in the importance of both maintaining those settlements and communities that had been built and maintaining whatever material and legal apparatus would allow that Jewish polity to remain a separate entity by and for Jews. So that's where I come in, and I'm sure in my later questions and answers I'll have more to say about it.
Thank you. So I'll just riff on that a little bit. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it, given everything that's going on. And let me begin, before I go backward, let me begin forward, that I think that we all here, sitting here, acknowledge that what's happening in Israel-Palestine right now is horrific and unacceptable. And we can talk about the realities and where to go from there, but I just wanted to kind of state that at the outset. One of the things I would add to Liora's definition is that Zionism was one of a variety of options for Jews in Europe in the wake of the emancipation of the Jews during the course of the 19th century to reimagine themselves in the larger world sphere. It wasn't actually a very common or popular alternative. There were many other alternatives that still exist in some form, but Zionism was, in a sense, the most impractical, and it somehow won the day in a way largely not of its own accord, but of other things that were happening within Europe at the time, ultimately the collapse of Europe through pogroms in the 1880s and through the 1920s, and then the rise of Hitler in 1933. And so in a certain sense, it was an impractical solution to an intractable problem that became, in a certain sense, the practical solution to a disastrous situation. Now, that doesn't mean that it itself didn't create other kinds of problems, or even recreate the problems that were happening elsewhere. But I think that it's just interesting to note as a historical point that its success was largely the result of the collapse of Europe and the reality that the Jews living there simply needed someplace else to go and someplace else to be. And of course, Palestine was not the only alternative. The United States, South America, other places as well, Australia, South Africa. But I think that it's important to see it within that context.
Well, to dig into that a little bit more, when exactly would you begin the history of Zionism? And what were its different strains in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? What pre-existing ancient, medieval, and early modern religious and cultural themes in global Jewish life were marshaled in the creation of modern Zionism? What were the factors that contributed to the rise of modern political Zionism in the late 19th century? Among whom was it first popular and why? And also who rejected it and why?
There's a big debate within people who are interested in this topic when Zionism begins. Within certain religious sectors, it begins with the patriarch Abraham. That Judaism, in a certain sense, is Zionism. I think for most people, in the academy at least, it begins sometime in the second third of the 19th century, in the wake of Ernst Renan's famous essay, What is a Nation?, and the rise of European nationalisms, and the beginning of the collapse of empires into these national entities. And the Jews, or some Jews, looked at the reality around them living in those countries, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany, the Pale of Settlement in Russia, and basically said, well, we can also become part of this nationalist trend. The problem that the Jews had was that they didn't have a land, where the emergence of these other nation states had a land. And then the question was going to be, well, you can't have a nationalism if you don't have a territory, although there were people that argued that you could. In any event, this then kind of moves back to the second part of your question, which is the ancient medieval notions of the aspirations that Jews had throughout the history of Judaism to return to this homeland that they called the land of Israel after the destruction of the temple, the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. I wouldn't call that Zionism. I would call that a kind of theory of redemption. And in a certain sense, Zionism really moves counter to a lot of those more traditional claims, which are basically saying the Jews are destined by divine decree to live in the diaspora, to be in exile. At some point in the future, God will intervene, the Messiah will come, the Jews will be restored to their ancient homeland. And by the way, that's not kind of endemic to Judaism, that's endemic to much of Christianity as well. Zionism basically is in some sense, a resistance to that trend, to say we're going to actually recreate some kind of political reality in this ancient homeland without the Messiah or before the Messiah. And I think that, so in one sense, Zionism is a continuation of an ancient past, and in another sense, Zionism is a rebellion against that past or a subversion of that past for a variety of practical considerations that we already mentioned.
Yeah, I guess I'll pick up there. There are a lot of parts to that question, so I don't know that either of us can get all of them. Yeah, I think it's really important to do, as Shaul does, try to understand both the really profound difference, but also perceived continuity between a much longer standing Jewish affinity to Zion, which is one of the biblical terms for Jerusalem, on the one hand, and the modern Zionist movement on the other hand, right? So Jews long had an affinity to Jerusalem and to the land of Israel as an origin point, kind of a mythic and kind of like macro-historical origin point, also an object of prayer, a place to which in Messianic times Jews would be regathered, right? All of those are features of Judaism, of rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism of the last 2,000 years. As is the idea of pilgrimage to that place, to Jerusalem, as were decisions of small numbers of Jews to migrate to Palestine and live there, take up residence there under whatever political framework was in charge at that moment. Once the modern Zionist movement came to exist, some would look back and say, well, all of those things were expressions of Zionism before Zionism, right? All of those were expressions of Zionism. I think it's misleading. In fact, it's not analytically very useful. Zionism begins when the idea of return moves from something that individuals or small communities might do and integrate into the political structures that existed, and develops into an idea of settlement for the purpose of forming some type of standalone Jewish community that would exist, at least to some degree, independent of whatever government was there, and certainly independent of the majority of the population that was there, which is something that Jews beforehand had never assumed was a goal, right? It simply wouldn't have been imaginable. There's a period in the 19th century, which happens to be the period where the Ottoman Empire starts to facilitate European migration to Palestine because it's in need of investment, it's in need of economic growth, and it starts to make it very easy and attractive for Europeans, mostly Christians, to come and settle in Palestine. This is also the period when the steamship is making travel more easier for many groups. And in that period, before the Zionist movement exists, some groups of Jews start to come in somewhat larger numbers, still very small numbers. And they also start to experiment with different ways of making a living in Palestine. So starting to engage in agriculture, which was not a common undertaking of mostly urban Jews, starting to think about Jews as more of a collective. Now, none of this is modern Zionism in the sense that it would become. But again, this too would be looked back on by Zionists as a kind of proto-Zionism. Now, interestingly, many of those same immigrants, some of them from Sephardi or Eastern Jewish backgrounds, are some of the same communities that anti-Zionists today would look back on and say, those were the Jews who became native Jews. Those were the Jews who were non-Zionists. So you have this kind of interesting 19th century period where you have Jews like experimenting with how do they choose to live that can be looked at and is looked at as both proto-Zionists and, if you look at it differently, kind of a non-Zionist or a counter-Zionist kind of posture. The beginnings of Zionism per se, I think, begin once a movement begins to try to actualize a program wherein, as I said before, the way to get from A to B is settlement, right? So it's not just that Jews happen to be settling, but that Jews, small groups, and then slightly larger, and only later much larger, starting to organize fundraising mechanisms, land purchase mechanisms, political negotiations with the empires at the time, to start to really actualize that idea that settlement was the path forward. So in 1897, Theodor Herzl, who's up on the screen there, formed the Zionist movement in Basel, Switzerland. In 1901, the Jewish National Fund is formed as the land purchasing body of the Zionist movement. And in 1908, the Zionist movement for the first time establishes an office in Palestine to facilitate those kinds of activities. So those dates are kind of within that period is where we can really see Zionism as an apparatus, right, as a set of institutions and practices that is beginning to actualize that project of settlement as a means towards a goal.
Great, thank you so much. So then how is it that Zionism came to be embraced by growing numbers of Jews around the world in the 20th century? And why? Conversely, what is the history of Jewish rejection of Zionism? For what reasons and in what geographies?
I guess we'll do it that way. So Shaul alluded to this in his previous answer, which is that initially Zionism, or the basic idea that mass Jewish relocation to Palestine was going to be the mechanism for solving Jewish problems, was roundly rejected by almost every category of Jews you can think of for a broad range of reasons. Most Jews assumed that whatever the solution would be in the place where they were already living. So whether that solution was becoming, growing more solidarity within traditional Jewish communities, upholding, the commandments of Judaism, whether that solution was joining the incipient socialist movements of the day, whether that solution was really committing to Jewish integration within emerging liberal orders. All of these were the much more common reactions. Also forms of cultural nationalism, sort of Jewish national cultural pride, schooling, but again, locally within the places they were living. And which of those were the most common depended on where you live. So if you were a British Jew, your anti-Zionism would have looked very different than if you were a Jew living in Warsaw or a small town outside of Warsaw. Why did this shift, That's one of the big questions here. How does something that goes from a really fringe movement become something that becomes, kind of one of the leading ideas and projects of the day? So a big moment here is the shift that occurs during and after World War I, when the British Empire and the League of Nations takes up the idea of kind of re-engineering the former Ottoman Empire, kind of making decisions and implementing policy that they think is going to ensure kind of a proper global peace, which really means the persistence of the imperial order in the world. And one piece, just one piece of that, is believing that encouraging Jewish migration to and settlement in Palestine, the creation of some kind of Jewish political entity, a state or a territory, would be a good idea for the international order, So sometimes Zionists would say, well, they recognize the right and legitimacy of Zionism. Well, maybe, but it fit into this broader idea of how they wish to engineer the post-World War I world. So now Zionism has the imprimatur, the stamp of approval of a major empire and the League of Nations that is saying we like the idea of settlement being the or a mechanism for Jews to solve their problems, and also kind of allows Jews, if they wish to be in the role of kind of a modern civilizing force within the Middle East, This is what modern powers did in that moment, was you brought modernity and you brought civilization. So this was a way for Jews who had constantly been told that you're backwards, you're not European, to say, we get to be on the side of civilization. They encouraged it. Maybe I'll turn things over to Shaul at this point.
I'm just going to add two additions to that. One is from the outside, and the other one is from the inside. From the outside, after the Second World War, 1945, and the support in the United Nations toward the establishment of a Jewish and Arab state in Palestine. That was partition, People talk about it as being the establishment of a Jewish state, which is true, but partition was really actually about dividing the land. Had really two factors. One, the revelation of the final solution, the Nazi final solution, and the world coming to recognize what had happened. And second, it solved a tremendous refugee problem. You had hundreds of thousands of refugees in DP camps who had no place to go, Jewish refugees from the Holocaust. And in a certain sense, it wasn't necessarily the generosity of the world in terms of the UN vote, but the UN vote to establish a state in Israel was really a solution to a refugee problem that needed a solution. I want to jump ahead to the 1960s in terms of Zionism's popularity internal to the Jewish world. And a lot of that had to do with the recognition among Jewish educators in the United States, some in Europe, already Israel is a different situation because it already is a nation state, that Zionism was probably the best way. By Zionism, I mean simply Israel advocacy was the best way to assure Jewish continuity. You're living in the United States in the 1950s, 1960s, a rapidly secularizing society. Jews are assimilating. Intermarriage rates are going up. And there's a fear of a certain kind of disappearance of the American Jew, and Zionism became a way, a tool, to instantiate a certain kind of ethnic pride in American Jews. So in some sense, the American Zionist story is at least as much about America and Jews in America than about Israel. That place that most Jews never heard of or never visited. Until 1967, the large majority of American Jews had never been to Israel. And most American Jews were exposed to Israel from two things: the Eichmann trial, which was televised, and Otto Preminger's movie Exodus. That's how most American Jews were that's how most Americans were introduced to Israel, right? A very propagandistic, highly unhistorical retelling of the founding of the Jewish state. So I think it's important to think about, since we are in America, that the story of Zionism in America is really much more a tool of American Jewish identity and American Jewish continuity than it is about the story over there. And we'll talk about later on why we think that that story is now reversing itself for a variety of reasons.
Can I say a little bit more on this question? Yeah, I think, I want to kind of address a question that I often get, which is, okay, well, maybe the early Zionists had this sort of big idea about they were going to have this project and this society, but what about all of the refugees, all the folks, the Jews who came because of a lack of another option, sort of regardless of what they thought about the matter? And I think it is important to recognize that over the course of the interwar period, right, from the 1920s to the 1940s, and really past 1948, and the Nakba and the war of Israelis' war of independence, many Jews became effectively structurally Zionist. That is to say, they needed a place to go, and the structure of the mandate, the British mandate's immigration policy, and then after 48 Israeli law, made Palestine, or then Israel, the best option, or in many ways the only option, right? And so Zionism became something like a belief that Jews should be able to continue using settlement in Palestine or Israel as a mechanism for providing Jewish safety. And for many Jews, nothing more than that, right? But that in and of itself is part of what makes the story of Israel and of Zionism. Actually, this is one of the ways that I see it as fairly similar to the story of the United States, where you have sort of ideas of settlement, but then you have wave after wave of immigrant and refugee populations who in many ways bolster a project of settler colonization, but not because they themselves had a big idea, but because they were looking for a place to go, right? So you end up with a lot of Jews, a lot of Israelis who end up structurally implicated in the systems and the society that Israel builds in order to protect them, even though they came as refugees or as poor people who had no other options, right? So my framing around settlement or settler colonization is not at all inconsistent with the fact that many, many Jews, in fact, over time, the majority of Jews were coming truly for lack of other options.
I just want to add one little footnote to that. There is a story, I don't remember where it came from. Somebody asked a Zionist if they could give me the elevator pitch of Zionism. And he said Zionism is like, I'm not sure I really want to use this analogy given what's going on in Southern California, but I'll do it anyway. That Zionism is like a person jumping out of the third story of a burning building and landing on someone else's head.
I think that was Isaac Deutscher.
It was Isaac Deutscher?
Who originally said that, yeah. So I want to ask a different question, which brings up a phrase that I don't think that has come up in your remarks yet, which is the Jewish question and the importance of what was called, especially in the 19th century, the Jewish question, meaning at a time when the countries of Europe, many of the nation states of Europe were actually coming into existence, what were they going to do about the Jews? And sometimes it was called the Jewish problem, okay? And that problem or that question was prompted by the fact that it was really hard to figure out what Jews were. Were they a religion? Were they a people, a culture, a nation, an ethnicity, all of the above? And one of the things we see actually in the 19th century is the splitting off of Jewish identity, which until that point had actually been comprised of all of those things into discrete categories. And depending on what group you were or movement, you might emphasize the religious aspect or the cultural aspect or the national aspect. And there were different, quote, solutions to that question, including, sadly, tragically, the final solution, right, which takes its name really from that. But at a certain point in Zionist history, we also have the emergence of what becomes known as the Arab question. And so I want to ask, when do Zionists start articulating that, addressing it, and how do they do that?
I think what's really so interesting about that question is that the early immigrants to Palestine, the early Jewish immigrants to Jewish Palestine, the early Zionists, they formulated that question quite early because they understood that if they had this national project of creating a Jewish state, and we can talk about what that actually means and how that term functions, how was that going to happen with this large majority of an Arab population? It wasn't called Palestinian then, it was called an Arab population, that were not going to be a part of this state project and were not going to agree with the state project. That was always the question. And the question never really gets answered, although they took the question seriously. One of the reasons I think that the question never gets answered is largely the result of World War II and the Holocaust. And afterward, in a certain sense, Zionism or the establishment of the state became almost an emergency or a necessity to solve a refugee problem or for a variety of other reasons. And this Arab question about how are these people going to be a part of, integrated into this society in an equitable way, even though the Declaration of Independence, the Israeli Declaration of Independence states that they would, practically and in an operational sense they never are, it never really gets dealt with. And I think tragically, October 7th was the eruption of the unresolved question of what is happening with this population who have, over the course of time and over the course of marginalization and so on and so forth, have developed their own national identity. So I think that the tragedy of Zionism is the very question that the early Zionists understood was never resolved and remains unresolved to this day.
Yeah, I think I would kind of differ with Shaul saying that it's never been resolved. I think de facto it's been resolved through both slow and sometimes really accelerated displacement of Palestinians. Now, it never fully, removed Palestinians, Palestinians are still very much there, very much present, although displaced and under assault. But again and again, what went from more of a theoretical conversation, should we include them? Should we hire them as laborers? Should we not hire them as laborers? Should we try to organize them into unions? Should we try to convince them of the utility of our project? very soon, it doesn't take long after World War I, even before World War I, for it to get wrapped into what Zionists understand as the security question, right? The securitizing of the project itself, which is, right, with each moment that Palestinians try to engage in any kind of, especially sabotage, right, against buildings, structures, or crops, or sometimes violence against people and communities, right, the answer becomes, well, we need to use the means of security or arms or violence in order to suppress this. And that begins in a really small way with building fences and putting up guard towers around, small settlement points. And then it grows into the creation of militia organizations, multiple militia organizations, and then it grows into, after statehood, the Israeli Defense Force. And that becomes not only, but one of the main kind of levers that Zionists use, because they don't question the fact that using settlement, migration and settlement as a means towards an end was the appropriate thing. So given that it was justified in their view, right, we need to defend it, right? And as time has gone on, the types and the extent of violence and repression that have been used have only increased. And I would agree with Shaul that October 7th, in so many ways, is the culmination of that. It's both the culmination of the attempts to sort of displace and repress, and it's also the culmination of the securitizing, right? Anything for Jewish safety, right? No holds barred in order to bring this hoped for future of Jewish safety, right? That's always the purpose and never entirely comes.
If I could say one more thing. I think it's important to insert it. I think that when the state was established in 1948, David Ben-Gurion, as first prime minister, made 3 crucial miscalculations. And I think that in 2025, we're living in the wake of those miscalculations. The first miscalculation is that he thought that eventually the Arabs would leave. Because why would Arabs want to live in a Jewish state? They could live in other Arab states. Again, the notion of Palestinian identity had not really taken form yet. The second miscalculation, that the ultra-Orthodox sector either would secularize in a generation or would leave. Because why would an ultra-Orthodox Jew want to live in a secular Jewish state? And the third miscalculation is that if there was a Jewish state, Jews in the diaspora would come. Because why would a Jew choose to live in the diaspora when they could live in the Jewish state? Those 3 things never happened. The Arabs didn't leave, the ultra-Orthodox didn't secularize, and diaspora Jews didn't come. And I think that the reality, the tragic reality that we're faced with now is the result of those 3 miscalculations. Now, in their time, they were perfectly reasonable. Europe had collapsed. The notion of a Palestinian identity separate from a larger Arab identity had not yet taken form. And the belief that somehow the state of Israel was going to be the panacea for Jews in the diaspora, I think the real failure of the third piece of diaspora Jews not coming, which is really in a certain sense what he recognized early on, was America. That America provided a place for Jews to live as an alternative to the state of Israel.
So I want to shift the conversation now to whether Zionism, in your opinion, the meaning of Zionism has shifted since October 7th. Mm-hmm. And also whether you think, or what you think that anti-Zionist protesters, and obviously there's a wide range of different kinds of protesters, but what do you think they mean when they use the term?
The term?
Zionism. Do you think there's just been a shift? Do you think it's used differently by different people who are pro-Zionist, anti-Zionist? Is there a continuum between the use of the term now compared to the Zionism that you were describing earlier, in its origins?
Right. Should I start? Or you want? I think, in a blanket way, I think that in America, when we talk about Zionism or a Zionist consensus, what we really mean is a liberal Zionist consensus. That is two-state solutionism, a liberal society, Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, which was not part of the 1947 Declaration of Independence. It was added into the Basic Law of Israel in 1985. That's the general kind of Zionist consensus. I think that October 7th shattered that consensus irreparably. I think that consensus is broken, and it's not at all clear that it's going to be able to survive or come back together. I think what ended up happening is that October 7th resulted in people in the liberal Zionist camp, which that center moved either toward the illiberal Zionist right or to the non-anti-counter post-Zionist left. And I think that we're living in the breach of that rupture at this point. I'm not sure really whether there's a way of putting that back together again. I think it'll probably look differently in the future once the war ends, hopefully very soon, and things begin to move in another direction. You know, this is a really a good question, because I think that anti-Zionism, which really in a certain sense has experienced a resurrection among Jews and non-Jews post-October 7th. It's not really at all clear what is meant by that term. And I want to suggest two things, and maybe Liora suggests others. I think that from my perspective, and here I'm speaking totally as an individual, as a citizen, to get at the core of this, I think we have to make a distinction between Zionism and Israel. Zionism is an ideology. Israel is a nation state. One can be anti-Zionist and not anti-Israel. One could say Zionism is an ideology that existed at a particular point in time. It had a reasonableness in terms of its emergence. It did what it did in all kinds of ways that were both good and bad, necessary and horrific. But it's not at all clear to me that it has a future. I don't think that Zionism as an ideology can necessarily produce an equitable society in that place between the river and the sea, where all of those people, where Israel will be a state for all of its citizens. Whether it's one state, two states, confederation, three states, I mean, those are things for political scientists to think about. And I don't think that Zionism really has a future. I think that Israel has a future because Israel exists. It's a place. And I think that more than people in the U.S., I think that people in Israel, whether they live in Khan Yunis, or they live in Jabalia, or they live in Ramallah, or they live in Tel Aviv, or they live in Jerusalem, they both actually, the Jews and the Palestinians, recognize the same thing. The Jews are not going anywhere. The Palestinians are not going anywhere. They recognize that. We may not recognize that, but they recognize that. And so the question is, whether we in the U.S. or elsewhere in the diaspora can really contemplate and think and construct different realities whereby the place can remain and the ideology that gave birth to the place may become a part of history.
Yeah, I think in this discourse that we are, many of us, part of, certainly listening to, there's a real kind of profound disconnect between a lot of discussions of Zionism among folks who consider themselves Zionist are about aspirations, right? What do we hope for? What do we imagine, right? The possibility, the counterfactual even, whether that's a counterfactual of Jews being safe or a counterfactual of a certain kind of Jewish cultural revival. Whereas for anti-Zionists, it's not about counterfactuals. It's about a protest against the realities on the ground that have, right? Like history has led to the realities on the ground, the material, structural effects of Zionist settlement, laws, policies on what began as the majority population, Palestinians, who, it's worth saying, were beginning to cultivate a collective sense of national consciousness already in the late 19th century, right? So it's not a recent development, right? So anti-Zionism is not against the sort of abstract idea of what Zionism could be or could have been, but rather it's very much a protest against the material effect. Right? Zionism is and has become, for anti-Zionists, the sum total of the effects that the policy has had over 100 plus years on Palestinians. And that's right, it's kind of a code word. It's really not about Zionism per se. It almost doesn't matter what's in that ideological box, right? What matters is the material, visible, right, military effects on the Palestinian population. So to be anti-Zionist is to be opposed to those effects and those processes, and to want to advocate for some kind of redoing or reversal of those policies and processes. But that's not to say that there's not enormous richness within these conversations. And I think, being able to kind of sit at the intersection of all this, to really kind of, be talking to my students who are part of the encampment and about the debates about, what are the tactics and processes of anti-Zionist activism. And among students who identify as Zionist, or they don't know what Zionism means, or they don't, right, there's a lot, this is a time of enormous amount of activation, right? There's activism, there's also activation of groups really thinking about how do they respond to a reality that, genocidal acts within Gaza, incredible feelings of unsafety among Jewish Israelis. This moment, I think, it's a crossroads. It's an unstable moment, and yet it's not new, right? In many ways, if you were paying attention to anti-Zionist activism or to Zionist student groups before October 7th, all of this was already there, right? So this is a moment of increased intensity, increased urgency, right? But I think many of these trends have already been unfolding for many, many years.
Okay, well, I do want to make sure we have enough time to get to audience questions. So I'm wondering,
I wonder if I could just ask the question about Haredi Jews.
Yeah, ask the question about
Okay,
Haredi Jews.
because I want to include a group that often isn't included in this, and it's one that's kind of close to my heart insofar as I know a lot of Haredi Jews, and I also write on the topic. So these are ultra-Orthodox Jews, Hasidim and otherwise, and I think it's important to include them because they will likely be around 40% of the Jewish population of Israel in 2050, as well as very significant percentages of Jewish communities elsewhere. And I can tell you that in my conversations with them, things like settler colonialism do not resonate at all, that kind of a category, because they have different worldview. They see this through a different lens, and it's important to appreciate that not only them, but a number of the groups that are heavily invested in this issue and that in demographic terms are very, very important in the issue, see this issue in ways that actually we haven't gotten to primarily, right, or even at all. And so for them, for example, they will affirm the God-given connection between what they would call in the Ashkenazi pronunciation, the European Jewish pronunciation, Am Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael, the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, and the land of Israel. And yet they have a whole variety of views on what they call Medinas Yisrael, the state of Israel. And so I guess I want to ask before we open the questions to the audience, and Shaul, you're an expert on this topic. Like, what would you say? Where do they fit into this? Into this question of Zionism and its future, its present, its future?
Yeah, this is a good question because it really goes under the radar, I think, of a lot of people in the U.S. I think in Israel, the story of the ultra-Orthodox sector, both in terms of issues of religious coercion and also on the Zionist question, really is much more salient. The ultra-Orthodox sector, or Haredi sector, was the base, in a sense, it was the base of the anti-Zionist ideology. They were opposed theologically to the possibility of the creation of some kind of Jewish political reality in the land of Israel before the coming of the Messiah. And they retained a certain kind of anti-Zionist narrative throughout the founding of the state, although they don't leave the state because they're not living in the state, they're living in Eretz Yisrael. They're living in the land of Israel. And the state enabled them to live in the land of Israel, but they were living in the land of Israel before the state, and they'll live in the land of Israel after the state, if the state ceases to exist. So the state is really kind of irrelevant to them. But something important is happening, and the November 2023 elections really showed a shift among a younger segment, the Gen Z Haredim, right, in their 20s, are increasingly voting for nationalist right-wing parties. In other words, the ultra-Orthodox sector is becoming nationalized because of two things. Well, there are probably many things, but two things worth mentioning. The emergence of ultra-Orthodox settlements, and this is part of the brilliance of the settler movement to create ultra-Orthodox settlements, and it's a win-win situation. They get bigger houses, more bedrooms for their big families, and the settlers get the beginnings of a constituency that eventually become part of their world. And the second thing is that these young ultra-Orthodox Jews, Haredim, from Bnei Brak and from Jerusalem, they consider themselves Israelis at this point. In other words, they've been Israeliized. They've been Hebraized. They're Hebrew speakers. They also speak Yiddish, but they're Hebrew speakers. And in a certain sense, they have as much in common with their non-Haredi generation that they do with their Holocaust surviving grandparents or great-grandparents at this point. So that whole kind of trajectory of ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionism, I think we're seeing the latter stages of it. In the November 2023 elections, one of the things great about the Israeli elections is that they actually publicize the voting numbers within particular regions, so you can look at a particular town and you can see who voted for who. The number of young ultra-Orthodox Jews that voted for Ben Gvir, which would have never happened 25 years ago. The ultra-Orthodox Jews voted for ultra-Orthodox parties. That was the whole point, if they voted at all. Now, from what Nathaniel said, this is very important, because if by 2050, 40% of Israel will be ultra-Orthodox, and those ultra-Orthodox have become nationalized, and the metaphysics and the theology of their way of looking at things really gives very, very easily in a political register becomes a radical right-wing ideology, I think that speaks to the rise of radical right politics in Israel in the next generation.
Okay, so hopefully we have people out there who can take your cards if you have questions, and we will have time to for our speakers to answer your questions. So if you have a card, please raise it. Okay.
Well, one question that immediately comes up that I've seen asked at very similar events is, what is the overlap between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a super important question, maybe one of the most hot debated topics. Obviously, there are different views on this question. There were some who will say that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitism or is rooted in or inspired by anti-Semitism. I don't agree with that position, right? I think anti-Semitism is something that we can find in a lot of movements in which the grievances of a movement get projected onto Jews as a group, right? So in a socialist movement, the real and legitimate grievances of the working class and the conditions of labor projected against Jews as a collective, as the imagined kind of actor behind the devious or the forces. So the anti-Zionist movement, too, is rooted in some very real and very legitimate grievances, right? Protesting a 15 or 16-month war and the, killing of tens of thousands of children and more. And it too, in certain ways, can be sometimes projected onto Jews as a group. Imagining the Jews as Jews, right? Or this is happening because Jews are behind it in a conspiratorial way. And I think, I feel encouraged that within the anti-Zionist movements, at least in Seattle where I live, there's many people who are trying to maintain a lot of awareness about making sure they notice that when they see it and do some education to try to make sure that that's not the message of the movement. But unfortunately, definitely that kind of conspiratorial talk and thinking about Jews makes its way into the movement of anti-Zionism. And I think we need to be really careful when that happens. We also need to recognize that, anti-Semitism is a real and extremely growing force on the political right. With the Trump administration coming into office, some very high-placed people are promoting anti-Semitic ideas. So we need to be really keeping our eye on the ball in terms of, who has the power to act on anti-Semitic ideas, and how can we in our own movements and communities try to root it out when we see it.
Okay, sorry about that. Zionism in the past displaced over 750,000 Palestinians from their homeland. Zionism in the present is committing a genocide in the name of Jewish safety, but does not keep us safe. Genocide creates more resistance by Jews who say not in our name and by non-Jews alike who say never again for Palestinians or anyone. Anti-Semites support this Zionist movement and genocide. What is the Zionism that supports Palestinian human rights? Is there a form of Zionism that you would say supports Palestinian human rights?
Yes, or there was, but yes, certainly. I think this is in a way back to the question of how October 7th changes that. There certainly were Zionists who were deeply committed to humanism and deeply committed to equal rights. And there were Zionists, I know that this is kind of strange to say now, some very prominent ones that were opposed to calling Israel a Jewish state, precisely for that reason. So I think that those voices, Martin Buber, Hannah Arendt, Hans Kohn, there are many, many names that we could mention in terms of people who were very committed to the notion of what they called a binational state in those days, right? I think that the project of Zionism as a aspirational project to create a state where, in the Jewish homeland, where Jews can govern themselves and also govern others in an equitable way, I'm wondering whether and if that can survive at this point. And I think that it may be that more than any other conflict from the founding of the state in 1948, through the Sinai in 1956, 1967, 1973, that October 7th really drives a wedge into the heart of Zionism, and whether it can survive or not remains to be seen.
Well, I've seen a few different questions come up about Mizrahi relations to the history of Zionism. I'm really glad that that came up from several different people in the audience, because what we mean by the history of Zionism in Europe is very different from what happens in the Middle East and North Africa, and then what happens with that population of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa when large numbers of them arrived in the state of Israel after 1948 in a big wave of the 1950s, 60s, 70s. So could you speak a little bit to those Mizrahi differences in the history of Zionism?
Yeah, thank you. And I was thinking as we were responding to these questions that we were not addressing this question head on, and I think it's indicative of the fact that so much of the both the early history of Zionism and the kind of institutional, governmental apparatus that creates and then runs the state of Israel is led by Ashkenazi Jews of various backgrounds and experiences. So when we talk about Mizrahi Jews, Mizrahi just means Eastern. It's the Hebrew word for Eastern. It's a term that comes into use after 1948 to describe, it's kind of an umbrella term to describe lots of different, often quite diverse communities of Jews from the Arab and Islamic world, all the way from Morocco to Iran and even points further east than that. There are many different stories of Mizrahi Jews. There are the small communities that were living in Palestine before the Zionist movement existed, alongside Ashkenazi communities doing the same. There were communities of Jews from Yemen who came and in fact were kind of brought into the apparatus of the Zionist agricultural settlements as workers, very much racialized as sort of Arabs who were also Jews, or Jews who were Arab-like and therefore could be hired in menial roles that perhaps some of the Jews from Europe didn't want to do. Migrants from, Ladino-speaking migrants from Greece who came in the 1940s. There were Holocaust survivors who were from Greece, right? Not all Holocaust survivors were Ashkenazi. And then the really big waves were after 1948. Jews from Iraq in the 50s, and then more than 250,000 Jews from Morocco, which is really Alma should be answering the question about them, it's her specialty, who have a range of experiences, but broadly find themselves absorbed by the state, but not in especially good conditions, and often facing in their daily lives real denigration and racialization on the part of Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. Comparing them to Arabs or comparing them to Palestinians, many feeling forced to suppress the Arab or Middle Eastern aspects of their identity, including the Arabic language, if that was their language at home. By the same token, many of them have very much benefited or have advocated for the growth of settlements in the West Bank after 1967, in part because some of those settlements have provided housing opportunities for folks who have not had the privileges of buying a Tel Aviv apartment in the 1930s. And in fact, see the elite Ashkenazi post-Zionists who think, well, settlement was okay, but we don't need any more of it, right? Saying, well, no, what about us? We're the ones who need, right, these new housing units, and often find themselves on the political right, a kind of populist right, with a lot of grievances towards the establishment. So a lot of complexity here around victimization, victimizing, a sense of selves as Zionists, but also a sense of themselves as victimized by the Zionist movement. And I think you have a great expert here on some of this history. And if you want to learn more, I really encourage you to take Alma's classes to really delve into some of those complexities.
So we have a number of questions that ask about the relationship of Zionism to Jewish trauma and the history of Jewish trauma and its relationship to the inflicting of trauma on Palestinians. And a number of them are quite long. So I'm gonna ask read one of the questions here, which is, what efforts have been made to develop a healthy collective recovery for the Jewish community as a whole from the collective trauma of the Holocaust? What would a healthy recovery look like? Has any consensus among Jews developed around developing such a healthy consensus meaning for the future of Judaism? And how might this be related to the project of Israel, the state of Israel, to Zionism? So I guess, what do you think the relationship is between Jewish trauma that Jews, and as well as trauma that then gets inflicted on others?
Wow, that's big.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just say a few things, and maybe Liora can jump in too. I think that I don't really know enough about how one processes collective trauma, one overcomes collective trauma. But I do know that I don't think Israel is doing a good job of it. I think that and I would say this before October 7th. October 7th and all of the analogies to Nazism are, or the Holocaust are, in my mind, absolutely egregious and a denigration to Holocaust survivors, frankly. To make the claim that somehow the Hamas or Nazis and the Jews living in the Gaza envelope were like the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, if that's true, then Zionism has accomplished nothing. Because the whole point of the project was that that would not be true. So that, I mean, I can understand taking one trauma and then layering it onto another trauma, but I don't think that does anything in terms of recovering from trauma. And anyway, I could go in. I don't want to go on about that. I do think that it's a crucial question for Jews, for Israelis, to think more carefully about what remembrance means without the constant reliving of the trauma, without giving trauma to another generation. And I think part of what we see in terms of young Jewish protest against the Gaza war, young Jewish protest against Zionism, young Jewish protest against Israel, is that those young people, many of you sitting here, don't have a living memory of that trauma and are refusing to allow that trauma to dictate how you understand the injustices that are being done in your name. And I don't think that that's a healthy recovery of trauma, because that just creates a conflict between one generation and another. But somehow, you know, I'll just quote Jacob Neusner, who's a scholar, famous scholar of Rabbinic Judaism, but he wrote a series of books on American Jews and Israel back in the 1970s. And he has this very interesting comment. He said, if the Jews cannot overcome, I'm not sure exactly the word he used, or heal from the trauma of the Holocaust, they will survive as a people. They just won't be a very interesting people.
So there are so many questions, and I just want to apologize in advance for not being able to get to all of them, but I'll read this one that relates to the idea of the future of Zionism, which we've touched on a bit in previous parts of this conversation. What does it mean to even entertain a world in which there's a future of Zionism when a genocide has been committed in the name of Zionism? What does a Zionist future mean for a Palestinian future?
It's a great question. I don't know. I think there's a lot of soul searching that needs to happen, and it's not happening right now. For various reasons that, you know, we could try to identify. I think that's right? Regardless of all the many, like the panoply of different things Zionism might mean or could mean or does mean to Jews or has meant to Jews in the past, right? It has become tethered, right, to what's going on in Gaza, also the West Bank. Many would say, well, what's new about this, right? Zionism was tethered to the Nakba in 1948, right? It already was tethered, right, to a process of, you know, mass displacement of Palestinians and, you know, appropriation of lands, right? But for those who somehow weren't thinking about 48, right, but are thinking about the images that they're seeing out of Gaza, right, Zionism is tethered to it, right? So a new generation maybe who aren't thinking about 48, but are thinking about 2023, 2024, 2025. I don't know. I think either there's two things that could happen. One is what happened with 48, where it was kind of justified away in the minds of Zionists. Well, it had to happen, it was tragic, or, you know, explanations that weren't true, that sort of they left of their own volition, such that it's kind of out of the frame, right? A kind of denial or a repression of it, or a real grappling, which is what should have and needed to have and still needs to have happened with respect to 1948 and the Nakba, but hasn't. But now there's this renewed moment, right? The scale of the displacement, the death, actually dwarfs what happened in 1948 in terms of sheer numbers. Maybe this will be the moment that there's this grappling, this thinking, this soul searching. And I don't know where that would lead. And I would hope that it leads to a place that is good and okay, including for Jews, right? I don't want to see Jews, swept away any more than I want to see Palestinians thrown under the bus, right? But it's a hard process that needs to happen.
So this is actually a follow-up, which is, can you talk about the peace and justice activism in Israel-Palestine, and how is that different from what goes on in the U.S.?
That's a good question. I think that there's really interesting things going on among Palestinians and Israelis, even post October 7th, that are under the radar of, I think, the American activist world, because I do think that many of the peace activists in Israel-Palestine recognize the inevitability of having to live together, and the result, and already share a culture, and already share a language, both the Palestinians speaking Hebrew and the peace activists speaking Arabic. It's very interesting. For example, I was in Berlin this summer, and in Berlin there's a very large Jewish Israeli population that lives in the same neighborhood as a large Palestinian population. So Israeli-Palestinian coexistence is fine as long as it's not in Israel. So there is the possibility of those kinds of things. I think, funnily enough, I'm involved with a certain group among settlers who are engaged in peace activism with Palestinians, and some of them are really doing some of the most interesting and creative work that's not happening among the lefties in Tel Aviv. Because I think that a lot of these settlers who see themselves as being peace activists, and the Palestinians, they have a deep connection to the land. Forget about the state. They have a deep connection to the land that has theological roots and has historical roots. And I think that, ironically, perhaps, some of the future of a real coexistence, and that coexistence, by the way, may be ultimately that Israel will not be defined as a Jewish state. That may be part of the process. But if that's the price that we have to pay for Jews and Palestinians to be able to live in that land where each community is able to have its own autonomy in some kind of shared sovereignty, if that's the price, then from my perspective, that's a price worth paying.
So there are so many competing questions, and one thing I want to say too is I'll be sure that both panelists get to read all of these questions once this program is concluded. So we'll be giving them.
Time for one more question, I think.
Yeah. Oh my God. Time for just one more question. Oh. Well, how about this one? Thinking both historically and contemporarily. What do you think the difference is among young Americans on views of Israel now versus historically? And do you think it will have any foreign policy implications, both for America and for Israel?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish Dov Waxman was here because he really knows the statistics. He's been, he's a political scientist among us who's been looking at some of these trends. One thing that has happened over the last years is the issue of Israel-Palestine has become much more partisan in the United States than it had been before, right? So although the Democratic Party in its sort of establishment is, or has been, promoting policy very similar to the Republican Party, there's a segment within the Democratic Party now that is explicitly anti-occupation or pro-ceasefire. And although it's a small number, and although they were denied a place at the DNC this past summer, nonetheless it's present and had not been present in the past. And I think especially among younger Americans, and I'm talking about Jews and a variety of other groups, right, you see more and more affinity towards those particular strains within the Democratic Party, sometimes outside the Democratic Party too. Now, for now, it's still a more marginal phenomenon in terms of activism, but when they do opinion poll surveys, right, there are larger and larger numbers that have really profound criticisms. It gets phrased in different ways. And I don't know what effect it has on politics. I think in the next administration, I fear that there's going to be even more repression of folks holding those kinds of opinions and using different kind of legal levers to try to do that on campuses and elsewhere, and not just around Israel-related issues, also around a whole variety of different protest issues. Nonetheless, though, once there's a trend, right, it's there, right? People can't simply be suppressed and silenced, and I think there probably will be a sea change, right, over the slightly medium and longer term. I don't know, but I think the trends are very much there, and I don't think they're going away.
Do you have anything to add, Shaul?
I wanted to say one thing, if I could. I consider myself very much a part of the left, very much a part of the progressive left, and I don't consider myself a Zionist. But I do want to say, for the record, that I think that the progressive left made a horrible mistake on October 8th. That we should have unequivocally come out to condemn what happened on October 7th. We can talk about armed resistance, we can talk about all kinds of things, right? I mean, we've all read Fanon, we all know what that's about, and we all have a sympathy for that. But murdering 1,000 people is not a legitimate form. Murdering 1,000 civilians is not a legitimate form of armed resistance. And I think that the inability to make that claim, and then to also continue to take the position that the anti-Israel, community takes against occupation, which itself is violent, and the legitimacy of resistance, and all of the things that is happening in the student encampments, I think it would have had so much more traction if the left was able to do that. And in the same way that the Israeli pro-Israel camp has to realize that, or should recognize that you can use the word genocide, you cannot use the word genocide, it doesn't matter. It's sociocide. It's the destruction of an entire society. That is simply wrong. And I think that the inability of each side to really make a certain claim of itself, to say that, no, we do not promote mass murder. I think that would help a great deal in being able to have the kinds of conversations that we need to have in order to move to the next stage.
Thank you, Liora. Thank you, Shaul. Thank you,
One announcement
Alma.
before we disperse.
One announcement.
One quick announcement. Thank you all so much for your patience, and we'll thank our panelists in just a second. But just want to put on your radar that on February 13th at 6 p.m., Derek Penslar will be coming to UC Santa Cruz, and he will be speaking on the topic of, is Israel a settler colonial state? So without further ado, please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you for your attention.